right, so welcome to Managing the Product Roadmap Amidst Uncertainty. I'll just do intros really quick, and then we'll get into it. First of all, for those who don't know us, this is John and Kyle with the Uncertainty Project. John and I worked together at Atlassian for the last 4 years, specifically with some of our larger Fortune 2000 customers. I was in product management with a product called Jira Line, and John was a solutions architect of the same product. And today we focus a lot on a problem that we felt wasn't really directly or explicitly addressed enough, which is decision-making and how strategy really truly helps navigate uncertainty. And so we started the Uncertainty Project to explore tools and techniques that help leadership teams craft ambitious strategies and make and communicate decisions better. And today we're joined by Christian. So Christian has spent over a decade in product management. Most recently, he spent the last 4 years at UserTesting as a VP of product management after they acquired his company, UserMuse, which was a two-sided marketplace for companies to find experts for feedback and research. I'm sure Christian can describe that a bit more when we get to it. So Christian has quite a few really great talks on product vision and road mapping. And we'll make sure that we go ahead and link a few of those full talks in the video notes. And we just wanted to chat about kind of the role of roadmaps in navigating uncertainty. So first off, thanks for taking the time today, Christian.
It's really good to join.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, if you can just give kind of a quick story of how you got where you are and how you've kind of shaped your views on product management and strategy as a whole.
Sure. Well, to start, it's a great, I think, interviewer or host tactic to make your guest feel happy and younger, because I've been in product management for close to 20 years now, or closer to 20 kind of birthday. feel getting up there. I spent the first, close to a decade of my career in product at a couple of different analytics software startups. That was really where I kind of cut my teeth. And it was sort of along that path, kind of a series of light bulb moments that just made me really crystallize and kind of figure out why, product management and figuring out what the right things to build were, what problems we should really be solving, why that was so difficult. In the B2B space in particular, it's either it's hard to get outside of your existing customer base, or if you don't have a big customer base, just to find enough people who are your target users and buyers. They're just hard to get a hold of. They're by definition kind of always busy when you're talking about B2B software, and people tend to value their time. And so it was one of the things that led me to co-found UserMuse, which was really aimed at making it super easy for B2B product design, user research, kind of you name it, anybody involved with kind of building and commercializing products to do more consistent, market testing, usability testing, and just user discovery. And so after a few years, UserTesting, as you mentioned, acquired us, and I went on to lead product there until the end of last year. And so, that's kind of how, I got here. And, over the course of time, especially at UserMuse and at UserTesting, where, such a large chunk of our customers were, product managers, designers, and people who were not just doing usability testing on products and prototypes, but really trying to do the kind of further up the funnel, user discovery and kind of market understanding to really try to get a better understanding of their users so they could figure out, what made them tick, what problems they need to solve, what was valuable to them and what wasn't, how they evaluated decisions and trade-offs and things like that. And so, it's definitely when you're in product and your customers are also in product and they have a high bar for products made by product people for product people, it has a way of focusing the mind on just kind of the discipline, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's always tough to have kind of other product people as customers in general. Probably even crazier to have a two-sided marketplace. You have one.
Yeah, I mean every issue is just kind of magnified because they can't understand how you would have missed something like that. And it comes down in a lot of cases to something that we're talking about here, which is prioritization and uncertainty and kind of looking at tough ROI trade-offs and things like that.
Yeah.
But
How
yeah,
do you how do you think about so just getting into, and it'd be good to cover I mean just vision in general as well, but you talk a lot about roadmaps, and obviously it's in the title of the talk here, but I think roadmaps tend to almost kind of feel like you're trying to kind of project certainty. It's almost like the antithesis of uncertainty. Like how do you think what's the role of a roadmap when it comes to navigating uncertainty as opposed to being on kind of the other side of the spectrum of communicating certainty?
Yeah, well, and I think we might as well get to this sooner than later. Like we probably need to make sure that we're all sort of using terms the same way when we talk about roadmaps, right? So let's, I think there's short term and there are long term roadmaps, and the sort of the altitude at which you're talking about those things is going to be really different if you're talking to a room full of VCs or investors, where roadmap there is something that you're probably talking about over a multi-year horizon, kind of at a high level, just to show sort of how the future of the business is going to play out and where the returns are going to come in and all that sort of thing. When kind of inside the company and maybe to customers, when you're talking about roadmap, you're really talking about something more tactical that's guiding your operations like week in, week out. And it means something much more concrete and tactical. I think of the roadmap, again, as most people generally mean it inside the company. It's the part of the long-term strategy, assuming that you have a clearly articulated one. It's the part of that long-term strategy that you're focused on in the here and now, usually over that next like 2 to 6 quarter time frame. And so I think it's good to be clear on what we mean by those. And that long-term vision and strategy, if you've done it right, it should be quite durable to most kinds of changes that will come up, because it means that you're shifting resource allocation across different priorities that are represented in that long-term plan. When you get to the near term, the order of things or the precedence or prioritization decisions, those can change, in a hurry sometimes, depending on like all the different kinds of, or I guess the sources of uncertainty that arise. And some of them are actually uncertainty going down, where the opportunity of something becomes clearer, the cost of something become clear, and uncertainty can go up, it can go down. Either way, it affects decision making, and I think that's part of the job when you own any piece of a product roadmap and its execution.
When you say uncertainty up and down, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think a good, probably soon to be and forever after, a classic example of uncertainty going sharply up would be the pandemic, right? Or a crash recession, if we want to go back to like 2008 or something like that, where all of a sudden your expectations for an acceptable timeline and path to profitability might be sharply different, or the ability of your customers to even engage with your product and the way you envision them doing it has materially changed, right? And that might require dramatic pivots in where and how you can deliver and realize value for the business, right? So that's sort of an easy, almost cop-out easy example maybe of where uncertainty can go up in a hurry. Less dramatic, but still significant examples might be just a less severe economic slowdown, or even internal company thing. So it's there are only so many people that can be privy to the clean room when M&A activity is being prepared. And so there are some people in the organization that are going to be surprised when you announce that you're divesting a unit or that you've acquired a new company, and all of a sudden now integration and making that acquisition work is going to take much higher precedence, right? Like those kinds of things that come up will change your product roadmap, and in the short term can create a lot more uncertainty for you about relative priorities. When it goes down, for instance, you might see that a certain feature or product adoption usage has exceeded expectations. And all of a sudden it's very clear to you that that's an area that you want to invest more in. You don't have to hedge maybe as much as you would have thought. So again, either way, those can change what your roadmap is going to look like as kind of the picture of where the greatest value or the most important objectives lie gets, either sharply clearer or, depending on the circumstances, a lot fuzzier.
Yeah, one of the other dynamics is, roadmap's a communications tool. I think getting back to definitions, I think that's the purpose of it, right? And when you think about the different audiences and how they consume it, that brings another element in, because a lot of times people consuming that, because it's got a timeline, it starts to look a lot like a plan, and they want to view it in terms of this is not so much something that is living, alive, will change as the world changes around it, but this is something closer to akin to a plan where I can start to bank on it. And I think that challenge of being able to look at roadmaps as living documents subject to change, that's been a struggle over the years as well. And that comes right back to uncertainty, but that's more from the vantage point of the consumer of it, where there's a kind of a conflict of interests, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I just sticking with the point of it being a communications tool. It's a communication tool for customers. But when you're talking about, roadmap, like capital R, what I think of as sort of like the nearish term, the whatever that forecastable horizon is for you, you're making, commitments there. Maybe the ones closer in are firmer than the ones that are kind of at the tail end of that outlook, that you can, coordinate and make other business decisions across other departments around. So, we are going to, target the release of this new widget at our annual conference or at a partner's annual conference. And we are going to have coordinated marketing activities leading up to that. We're going to have, partners who are going to present with us on stage. So you can, it's an important and pretty critical communication and kind of collaboration sort of, so what I'm looking for, just kind of touchstone, I guess, for, organizing lots of business activities around when, you plan to have certain things available, whether you're talking about the sales training, the comp plans, how it's going to be priced and released and all of that stuff, right? And I think the roadmap is really important internally, obviously, for doing all of those things too.
I feel like, you already talked about the uncertainty that arises when like something changes, right? But what about like the level of uncertainty that we kind of have like in the at the very beginning, right? As far as just saying like how much is enough uncertainty to just go ahead and stomach, and like and how do you kind of represent that there's just a lot of unknowns, but we're moving forward and kind of able to just move forward with those unknowns? Like how's that? I feel like there's always just a struggle with roadmaps when they start to just feel like commitments, as opposed to saying that, well, we also have kind of a lot of these open questions and we're going to get answers to those questions, and that might, you say like roadmap subject to change, right? Like things might look drastically different, but we are still committing to the fact that we are addressing this problem. We will continue to address this problem, right? Like does that belong on a roadmap? Does that feel like it ends up just being, more like upstream work cycles? Because I think a lot of times, especially with roadmaps where there's kind of like a start and an end to a thing that starts and is done, is then you can often just you can lose a lot of like the long tail cycles of learning, that isn't kind of like originally represented, right? And there's a fight downstream to go fill right, more capacity on that roadmap. So where does that belong? How's that better communicated?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think just a simple point maybe up front is I think it's one of the reasons why, again, the long-term vision and kind of your core strategic objectives that guide, over the multi-year horizon, like where you are planning to invest, maybe in some sequence. Your most, teams I've worked on, we've had, at least some kind of process where we're doing rolling planning. And so if it's a 4-quarter roadmap, every quarter we are revising, and looking at what priorities have changed, and you're adding that next month on to the end. I think you almost have to. I think the some of the people who've really thought and written a lot about this. You know, kind of would echo what I've seen and found kind of most effective there, because it depends on the scale of change you end up encountering, and also just how wrong you might have been about this or that, even if it's not changed. Sometimes the change is just that, like, we were wrong about something.
Right.
But I think if you look out 4 quarters, let's say, in the quarter coming up, you should have a pretty good firm understanding of what we are going to deliver, because you have to be pretty locked in at that point. You have to have done kind of the upstream work and have a pretty good understanding at that point of capacity, ability to deliver, why we're doing it, the values there, all that stuff. And then that that degree of certainty around what you're going to deliver thins out as you look to the horizon. And I think the way I try to look at it, and I think this is somewhere between obvious and profound maybe, is even if the number of things on your roadmap looks about the same, in 1 quarter out versus 4 or 6 quarters out, the number of things that you're committed to delivering on there goes down as you look further out. So I think it's helpful to be able to look further out and say, at this point, we can commit with as much certainty as we're able to from where we stand today, that we are going to deliver this thing or these 1 or 2 things, whatever that right number is. These are other things that we expect and plan to deliver, but if we need to, we will divert resources, funds, people from those things to ensure that these 2 things hit, like those. And so I think the scope of work you plan to do doesn't really change. You're going to have people busy working on things that presumably are valuable. The number of things that you are committing to as you go further out, I think, should go down. You have to have some flexibility in there, both, again, to deal with all the uncertainty that's just inherent in life and business, but also, I think set expectations appropriately, and keep your team and your organization, product, engineering, design, data science, everyone in a position where you're not overstretched. You've got some built-in flexibility to adapt, and you're not quite so locked in as far as people setting expectations, which always have a way of reaching customers before they should, and things like that. So I think that's the important thing to do, and also to make sure that everyone internally knows that. I mean, that's the real benefit. Again, bringing it back to the communication value of having that roadmap that is in writing, that's visible, and is explained to the organization.
What are the
one other thing on that too is, like, the challenge of backing away from seeing as a commitment and more as guidance. The power of that is then the roadmap can really serve as an invitation to collaboration, whether that's you were talking about how the fidelity has to increase as you get closer to the quarter where you're actually going to do some work. That invitation to come in and say, hey, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? That's just a matter of levels within the same organization. Mm-hmm. Or side by side, you talked about coordination for a launch and the challenges there. The world's going to change. Uncertainty is going to do what it does. But then that ability to cross-check roadmaps, whether it's narrow frame or larger frame, and then just, this is one really important tool to dealing with dependencies that are inherent within an organization. Then, of course, if you're a customer, you're probably making some decisions based on what you're seeing from this vendor or whatever mm-hmm. supplier you're dealing with, and that's where it gets even trickier to detach yourself from. It's not a commitment, it's guidance. Mm-hmm. But how do I do what I need to do as decoupled as possible, leveraging the roadmap and understanding that their world is the same as mine, and I need that flexibility you talk to.
Yeah.
And then how do you see the strategic aspects of that too? Like, there's one thing to have to react, I guess, more in a tactical sense, but if we back it up to more strategic shifts, how do you see that flowing into roadmaps?
Well, so again, I think one of the most important artifacts I think we can produce as product leaders is having the clear alignment, and something that explains that here's our long-term product vision, and it's the same today as it was last year and the year before. Here are the big long-term kind of strategic problems or investments that we have to make. We are always going to have to onboard, new users and get them productive and engaged quickly. We are always going to have to do, yada, yada, yada. Those break down into things that, are sub problems, then get more specific and eventually down to, specific capabilities or features or even, new products. When you're talking, long-term shifts, the benefit of having something like that and being able to frame that, again, I'll say near-term roadmap within the context of that larger strategic framework, is that you can show that, hey, when those priorities change, we're not really changing the strategy. In fact, we're not at all changing the strategy. What we're changing is the near-term execution plan. We are shifting focus within this long-term plan, but we are still we're still going to the same endpoint. Our path getting there is going to be a little bit different because of XYZ, and you can communicate that and show that. I think I don't know if this answers your question exactly, but I think that's such an important piece, both so that everyone can see how what they're working on lines up to the big picture. I think it also just really facilitates kind of like big trade-off discussions. One, it makes them concrete. You can all look at this thing and say, if we are not going to focus on this customer segment and what they need as much because we have these kind of corporate imperatives or just whatever's guiding it, we know that this is where we need to focus more of our attention right now. You're kind of set up to have that discussion in a really like practical and kind of tangible way. Whereas if everything kind of exists in this flat plane, or even worse, if you've done that thing where you kind of, I think it's easy to do, where people kind of use strategy and roadmap interchangeably, and that they really shouldn't be. If your strategic outlook only goes out as far as your delivery roadmap, I think you're setting yourself up for a lot of trouble in that way.
Well, another interesting thing between the two is,
yeah.
Oh, sorry. You hear a lot about how strategy is as much about where you plan to go, but also where you don't want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. A lot of the conversations you hear about roadmaps are more about what's missing than what's there. So a good strategy can sometimes reinforce and say, well, the roadmap is this, and you have some questions about some things you don't see there. But if I could refer you back to the strategy, you see that the absence is a very explicit choice that was made. And so that reinforcing support there, all drawn from the user research, probably, to talk about why you're choosing this, not that. I'd be curious, like as how does the very front end of that, which I think very well, how does that flow through to help those choices get made? That is almost like, this is what we're not going to go do. And how does the why find its way into a roadmap conversation? I've always seen a lot of struggle on that. I was curious if you have seen that done well.
I have, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, and then what it's looked like. As you guys have worked at, I think one of the more respected product organizations at Atlassian. So, just kind of bringing it back to your question is, how do you kind of bake in that why, and where the connection from like the long term to the short term comes in?
Yeah, or like I've been in conversations on a roadmap where somebody had an idea and they thought it was going to be there, and then it's not there, and it's a very sound decision why it's not there. But sometimes that why is lost, and if you start to back up to that, sometimes you're lucky enough to have some explicit strategic statements, but oftentimes it goes even upstream of that. I think into some of the area of where there was some research done, the market was studied, and very deliberate choices resulted from that. I was curious if you could kind of fill in the gaps. How have you seen that work so that once a roadmap's presented, there's less questions around it? Maybe that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I apologies. I see what you're saying now. So I think every instance of the roadmap involves trade-offs, and prioritization and like the difficulty of saying no, and all those kind of like tropes that we hear about product management. I mean, they're tropes because they're true, and there's a lot of validity to them. By definition, prioritization means you're choosing not to give value to some group, right? And so those questions will always come up. I've never not had that happen. Again, having that long-term view presented, having it clear, and doing it a lot. That's not like a one meeting thing. Like you're probably doing that at least once a quarter to half a dozen or more groups in the company, depending on the size of your organization. So I think that the consistency in that matters. I think one of the things that you mentioned at the start too is, the roadmap is about addressing gaps as opposed to being, deliberate, saying, hey, this is what we're going to build because it's part of this piece of the bigger picture, right? I think that I don't know if this is a tangent or not, but it's really easy if you don't have that, all those pieces connected, where you can actually show that, hey, our roadmap is basically, it's addressing these parts of this long-term plan. When you don't have that and you can't connect it, it's really easy for the roadmap to almost go on autopilot, where it's teams at whatever level can always identify incremental fixes or extensions of something, or respond to valid customer feedback on things that are missing, pain points and whatnot, but they don't get prioritized and kind of set within a discussion or a real assessment of what is the most important thing for us to be investing in as a business right now. Yes, those things that could be done that just where the roadmap almost kind of like writes itself because things have been added into the Jira backlog, let's say. And so you can fill up, the next, 6, 8, 10, 50 sprints with just stuff that's in that backlog, but it's not really, thought through. And we're not saying, okay, we need to actually shift attention away from this. We could do this, and there's a non-zero benefit to doing these things, but it's not as important to realizing our goals as a product organization, as a company, as actually shifting our attention to these other things. I think that's an area where I see that happen quite a bit. As for the upstream research piece, I think it's always happening, and sometimes it is, coming from your user researchers or your product managers who are out there doing market scoping, and that's what we should be doing. But those are almost always, one among many inputs that you're getting, right? You've got your sales and marketing organizations. You've got feedback from customer success. You've got maybe your most important strategic accounts. You've got other changes or opportunities that have come up, and some of the things that we mentioned. So I think those things are always factored in. I think that's why, because there's such a constant stream of those, you have to be able to plan and update your roadmap on a pretty regular basis and really have a process for doing it. Not to use the P word too early in this conversation. I think also, the explaining the why and what's not going in and what is, I think that the two things that are really important, I think, to do, and I've underestimated or underinvested in them at times, and it's always bitten me, is one, when you update the roadmap and you kind of like roadshow it internally. Yes, getting some feedback, particularly in the out quarters, but also just to make sure people understand what's in there, what's not, and in that you're explaining the why. I think the other is for all of the internal tickets or enhancement requests or whatever that just inevitably come up, that you're closing the loop on them. And even if, in my experience, it's been surprising at times, although it probably shouldn't surprise me at this point, that most people, maybe not all the time, but if you tell them, like, we understand, we hear you, we can't do this right now, and here's why, or this is in the roadmap but not for another couple of quarters, that's a perfectly acceptable and understandable answer to a lot of people. Just throwing enhancement requests into the abyss and not hearing anything back and never closing the loop, or never getting the, like, hey, these are some of the things that we released last quarter in response to some of these other things that have come up and come in from the field or finance or operations or whatever the source is. That's really important to do as well. And I think it's part of a larger story you're telling of how we're responding to all of the inputs that we get and being judicious about how we make decisions. And I think just also, kind of explaining the thought process there and recognizing that not everybody can always be happy, but at least they can understand why you did that.
Well, and that's a great point. That's where I was going to go next too. Like those judicious decisions, good strategy, they'll teach you about good strategy. They say you make tough decisions. You're going to please some people. You're probably going to make some other people unhappy. If you try to please everybody, that's not a good strategy, almost by definition, right? So the implications of that are probably when you get your communication tool ready, your roadmap. I guess it would mean you'd almost have to expect that if you have 5 audiences for that roadmap, you're going to get applause in 2 of them, and the other 3, they're going to be slinging arrows at you, and you almost have to come to expect that. And I mean, that's the reality. But I guess I haven't thought that a roadmap presentation. When you walk into a room, you probably have to know whether these are the people that are probably going to be excited about your strategy, or these are the people that are not excited about your strategy, but yet you got to hold your ground, and that's part of what great strategy looks like.
Yeah. I remember, and especially at Atlassian and even with, customer communication, but also with other things is, even just being very explicit about, the beliefs that we have, the assumptions that we're making, the principles that are going into why we're making specific trade-off decisions, and doing a lot of work of communicating those things up front. Like, and that gets into a lot of the stuff that we talk about with decision making, where a lot of this communication happens, far before a decision point being made, is, agreeing on a lot of those things, or at least making those things explicit, when often those things are not explicit. They're very implicit, and we might all be operating on very different models and different assumptions that we're making, and beliefs that we have, and the decisions that we're making. And, and so really what we're not disagreeing on is necessarily the roadmap in front of us, or the strategy, but, a bunch of, underlying layers that might be kind of like deeply seated, whether in individuals or the organization as a whole, that has driven, decision after decision after decision in the past, to get you to that point. It's not really actually like the artifact that's in front of you, or like the issue that's directly in front of you at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. And I think also, part of what makes, like the sort of classic, piece of advice of, that by the time you go into the meeting, you should know what's going to happen, and you've kind of pre-wired, the people in there for it. There's that whole substrate of just being in constant communication and keeping people informed. Like nobody, whether they're important in terms of, the decision-making hierarchy, I shouldn't say important, whether they're, whether their scope of responsibility within the business is really large, or whether they are most junior employee, like most people don't like being surprised in the meeting, or finding out something the same time as everybody else, like hearing about it in the paper, right? By the time, you go into any of those presentations, like there should have been a lot of like ongoing discussions. And, in a lot of cases, they'll get put on your calendar, whether you seek them out or not, but it's still incumbent on I think a good product leader or design leader, or choose your role there, but I'll just stick with product. If you're not talking regularly, and by regularly I mean like a few times a month, with your key like heads of regional sales teams, and product marketing folks and customer success, if you're not regularly in dialogue with all of them, and you kind of have that intake outtake, and actually doing some of those presentations or meetings together, where you're kind of you're seeding their understanding of the decisions and trade-off that that you've made, or that you're going to make. Waiting until you've got a set of slides up that summarize the roadmap, in a meeting with 100 or 200 people, like that's a tough place for people to have to like react to it on the spot. And I think you probably raise the chance you're going to have some emotional reactions, and they're justified. They might not always seem fair to a product person who's presenting it, but one of the things I used to always tell my product teams, especially when it came to sales feedback in particular, not to pick on them, but I choose sales here for one specific reason, which is, this is what I said to my product teams, like just remember that when they're bugging you about something, their relationship to the company is based on a lot simpler arithmetic than yours is. And it's going to hit them a certain way if they don't feel like you understand why their needs are important, even if you're still saying that we just can't get to that. We understand that that is going to make a renewal or an upsell discussion potentially harder. But we can't do that right now for these reasons, or we've chosen not to, because we've got to address these other things like that. That's inevitable, and I think it's part of just the real like soft skills relationship building piece that is so important to just managing people, but also getting them bought in, even if there are parts of it that disappoint them. And like, I think, John, to your point, where you're talking to 5 audiences and some will like it and some won't. I think within every audience, there'll be some people who are, high-fiving, and others who are either raising their hands to ask pointed, why isn't this there type questions, or silently sending you Slack messages while you're trying to get through.
Well, I love your point about not being surprised. When we talk about uncertainty here, usually we're talking about uncertainty in the world around us, but there's a whole nother kind of uncertainty within large organizations that are very complex, where the information just doesn't make it around. The communication is not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm sitting in a room and I'm the last to know, that's a personal uncertainty that impacts how I perceive what I'm seeing. And the more you can get to greater transparency around the strategy, greater transparency around roadmaps, at least that's an uncertainty under your control, right, within
Mm-hmm.
a company. And then you can shift your focus more to the stuff that's outside of your control, which is challenging enough as it is.
Yeah, I agree. And, in my experience, like far more often than not, I'm speaking about my experience in software companies for sure, but most people understand how hard the job is of prioritizing, because I think by definition, every company's ambitions exceed its capacity. Doesn't matter how many people you have with hands on keyboards, right? There's always more things that you want to do that would add value than you can do. And you've got lots and lots of people whose priorities aren't necessarily aligned. You've got lots of customers whose expectations and priorities aren't aligned. And you're trying to balance all of those, plus the needs of the customers who haven't said yes yet, right? Like one of those tough prioritization decisions that, I mentioned, like the roadmap being on autopilot. Like, it's really easy if you want to go about it in a sort of low calorie, not super thoughtful way, to just keep, doing the next logical thing for XYZ piece of functionality, right? It's also easy to keep saying yes to the things that your existing customers need. I mean, and this kind of gets into like innovator's dilemma type territory. But at what point does the opportunity cost of spending a chunk of resources to deliver something that is going to be maybe super important for a super important piece of your installed base, but it means that you are not addressing or not investing in the things that are going to expand your reach into new markets, new customers. Like, that's a really hard trade-off. And if there's nobody in your revenue organization, for example, who's like particularly incentivized to care about that yet, you've got people's priorities that are for totally valid reasons just not super aligned.
Yeah. And another challenge of priority, I think you've probably seen this too, is without a strong strategy that you can lean back on and say, this is the why. I think we all are very vulnerable to like availability bias, proximity bias, recency bias, where, hey, just yesterday, this conversation happened with this customer or with this stakeholder. And therefore today, as I set priorities for the next quarter, suddenly this is what's commanding my attention as I prioritize, versus, there's a well thought out strategy produced 6 months ago, and I'm towing the line, and we're thinking with that long-term perspective more in place. It's hard, right? but that's that relationship of road mapping to strategy that helps you, work against some of those natural biases that we all live through too.
Yeah, and I mean, and look, and sometimes to those short-term disruptions, the right answer is yes. Like we, you guys have been in public company environments. I was, my last role at UserTesting, and if, for example, just that, or you've been told that the street questions and the guidance and what they're really valuing is the growth and health of your customers who are spending more than 100,000 or more than $1 million or more, and that can change, how you factor requests that serve those into your calculus. And so, having a clear long-term strategy, it doesn't or shouldn't reduce your ability to be flexible. I think rather what it does is when those new things or those unexpected things come up, they shouldn't be things that don't fit anywhere into that strategy. If you've really thought about what are all the different mechanisms by which we're delivering value over the long term, anything you can toss at a company should be able to fit into one of those things that you've identified if you've done that well. And you're saying, it actually the rationale for us to accelerate this thing for these kinds of globally important customers to us, that math works out for us right now. That's a pretty important thing. And if you're responding to requests that came in through whatever channel that are being demanded by very loud and important customers, your decision to respond to that might not be solely because those customers said so and you're just being at their beck and call. It's that actually there's not doing that in this case is actually more costly and potentially harmful than adjusting the plan short term. And again, I think the durability of a long-term plan versus the adaptability in the near term is those two things shouldn't be at odds with each other. It doesn't mean that change isn't disruptive and sometimes painful. But again, at least you can show people that, hey, we're not changing the strategy. We're kind of zigging and zagging, but the end point is what it's always been.
Yeah, and that's difficult, right? I do think it's hard to be able to balance. You don't want people to kind of feel like a whiplash of we're always changing directions, and so being able to kind of constantly communicate that there's alignment to what that strategy is. I do think there's some default, right? It's almost like it seems like there's a few things that everything will kind of always trend to if there isn't a very explicit way that we are making decisions or trade-off decisions or talking about even overstatements or things like that. So it's you will always trend towards just firefighting or towards the availability heuristic that we're just going to whatever squeaky wheel is the loudest is what we're going to address if there aren't structures in place to kind of pull away from those things or being explicit about. It's no, we don't make trade-offs like that because we focus on X. Which both sides of that are difficult for sure.
Yeah, and I mean it's there's a really admirable reason for why at least part of that happens, which is that you've got teams of people who want to do their best work, and whatever they see in front of them can almost always be made better. And I think there's a very natural inclination by a lot of people to quote unquote finish the job with something. And so the how complete is complete enough for this thing right now where the marginal return of adding something else to it just really is not the best use of our resources right now. And I think the more you can think about your roadmap as a as a resource and ROI allocation exercise, the better. And that's why again at all those levels in kind of your long-term strategy, and you've got kind of guiding metrics associated with those. And so that's another whole thing we haven't really got into, probably don't have time to. It's probably a separate discussion today, is kind of measurement amidst uncertainty. But sometimes the numbers make things clearer, sometimes they don't. I've always said that the hardest question in business, probably in life too, for that matter, but definitely in business, I think is this thing not working or is it not working yet? And if it's not working yet, where do we think we are in that curve, and how much more are we willing to invest in this thing? That's hard for a ton of different reasons. And talk about uncertainty. Yeah.
Do you have time for one more question, Christian?
Sure.
So on that subject, we talked about just the much bigger cycles, right? So the cycles that kind of think about breaking the status quo, right? We're just going to kind of naturally trend towards complacency, continuing to invest in the things that we've always invested in, right? When it comes to when it comes to, I guess really that relationship of having a broader vision, or really just kind of, going after much more ambitious big bets. Like what about those cycles, right? To be able to focus on those things, and be able to give kind of, allocation towards those things, or even start, taking bite-sized pieces, right, out of like highly ambiguous, highly uncertain things that, what tends to happen is really that we might propose, a big vision, something like very ambitious, but as you dig into the details, more questions arise until it gets to a point where there's just too much ambiguity to really stomach. And, things just kind of, really just patter out, and, it fizzles out. So over time, right? How do you get to some of those like bigger cycles?
Well, I mean, it's another good question, where the question might be better than the answer in this case. I think there's definitely, part of it is just breaking down those things. The larger the scope of any single thing you're trying to do, I think the more uncertainty and sort of project risk you're inviting. If you don't sort of like chunk that out in ways that make the problems or the investments more tractable. And I think there's a real art and science that kind of goes into that. And I've been fortunate to work with people who are like exceptionally gifted at being able to really think about structuring work and sort of de-risking bigger bets without sort of abandoning progress. So that's kind of one big aspect of that. I think one of the things I like about just having I think of these in like a visual kind of like tree hierarchy of the big pillars of the long-term strategy broken down into smaller and smaller problems and ultimately down to features. Is it sort of naturally forces you to look at things and just say, okay, what are we not doing right now? Like, what have we said we were going to do that we're not? And those kind of like big cycle conversations, like they're not just product organization investments, really. If we talk about, all right, by 2 quarters from now, we're going to spend 75% of our development capacity on the requirement set that we've identified that allows us to really attack this new market, or this place where we're really underpenetrated. If you don't have the people in that discussion from a commercialization and go-to-market standpoint, who are ultimately going to be responsible for making sure that those investments on the product side pay off, you're doing yourself a disservice. And so I think those big cycle, to use your words, kind of discussions, I think you're more likely to frame those when you're showing everybody and constantly revisiting. Here is the long-term view, and these are the things that we need to do to realize that vision over the long term. If for different reasons, and there are a million why it's going to happen, but if you are continually not investing in some of the areas that you've all acknowledged are part of the long-term plan, you do have to ask why, and do we need to, in a really coordinated way, like across product, marketing, customers, all of it, right? Those things, at a certain size become like whole division or whole company discussions, and they should be, right? You need everyone to make these, sort of investments successful and to have happy, growing customers. And so I think, again, having the consistency in that view of the long-term view, it allows you and kind of gives you a natural way to force those conversations. And if we're going to say that, hey, we're not going to hire a sales team in that region, or we're not going to spin up investment in whatever it might be that would allow product investments that we might make there to be successful, then we shouldn't put that on the near-term roadmap. Nobody wants to work on building products that don't go anywhere or have no sales force or have no market ready to use them, right? Like, that's the most demoralizing thing. I think that's even worse than like whiplash of changing direction, is like working your ass off on something that just like goes nowhere, like that's even worse. So I think having a consistent, like touchstone and a mechanism for addressing what are we not doing now, and are we okay with that? And if we're not, how are we going to change? What are we not going to do elsewhere and live with? And are we going to prepare whoever needs to be prepared for that message? And how are we going to coordinate, across departments so that we know that we have the best chance of success when we do actually hit go on some of these things that we're making a decision to really start attacking.
Yeah, sometimes I ask the question as far as just the capacity for an organization to be able to chase big things sometimes, whether or not it really kind of you think of like Atlassian's a founder-led company, right? Like you see a lot of founder-led companies really having much more of a capacity to go chase ambitious things. Like how much of it really just like boils down to it's they have the ability to hold a lot of conviction and to be able to get a lot of people on board and build a lot of momentum that a kind of just multi-year stint CEO like might not be able to do, like right. And then obviously there's probably levels of that, right, as well. But
yeah, I could see that going either way, to be honest. I having been a founder before too, like it's not at Atlassian scale, I'll just say, but I mean, you're so attuned to every customer need, and so that also can be kind of hard, even though you might have your eye on the big picture. You're probably the person who wrote it. Like there's so many like conflicting pressures on you there. It's why like most founders, certainly not all, get to a point where they say like, I want somebody else to run product here, that just wakes up thinking about this organization and their challenges, and can also be like sort of a counterweight to me, and be a partner that way. I think that's when most founders are making that transition to bring in somebody for the first time to run product. That's often part of the motivation, or it's what's being impressed upon them by maybe their board or their investors. I think the part of the other thing is, whether it's founder led or not, it's a leadership thing. Doing big things, yeah, it takes big vision and it takes sort of clarity of purpose, but I think by definition, doing big things requires some like organizational juice, right? Because it also means you're saying no to other big things, or maybe lots of other small things. Like you have to have people who are either able to themselves make that kind of decision, or are really effective at marshaling the people that they need to in order to get things done, and align, again, like the sales training calendar, the market release calendar, the obviously the development roadmap and cadence, and all of those things in a coordinated way. So there's like the bigger things you're doing, almost by definition, like there's lots of other big things you're not doing because you don't have endless resources, and big things usually require big input, or big amounts of inputs, I should say.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks again. We took you over time, but
my pleasure.
Appreciate you sticking around, and yeah, we'll have to do this again. Appreciate it.
Sure, I look forward to it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Christian.